The Christmas table looked perfect that night, roast turkey steaming, fairy lights blinking softly, laughter bouncing off the walls of the home I had spent 30 years paying for. My 380,000 house wasn't flashy, but every brick carried a memory. My late wife's laugh in the kitchen, my son's height marks on the hallway wall, the quiet pride of knowing I built something solid from nothing. I excused myself to grab dessert from the kitchen. That's when I heard my daughter-in-law's voice, low, confident, careless. "Once Dad's health gets worse, we'll just move in. This place is too big for him anyway," she said, chuckling. "My parents can take the master bedroom. He won't say no. He never does." My son laughed softly. "Yeah, we'll say it's temporary. He'll cave." I stood frozen behind the half-closed door, the pie plate shaking in my hands. They weren't joking. They weren't whispering out of guilt. They were planning. My home, my life, already divided up like an inheritance that hadn't even begun. I walked back into the dining room with a smile so calm it scared even me. I served dessert. I hugged everyone goodnight. I wished them Merry Christmas. That night, I didn't sleep, I didn't cry. I planned. The next morning, I called a lawyer. Within 2 weeks, the house was transferred into a trust, ironclad, untouchable. I quietly updated my will. No drama, no announcements. Then I did something else. I told my family I had made a terrible mistake with an investment and lost most of my savings. I said I'd need to downsize soon, maybe rent a small place. The change was immediate. My daughter-in-law stopped calling. My son became busy. Invitations dried up. When I hinted I might need help fixing a leak, they suggested YouTube videos. When I mentioned loneliness, they sent emojis instead of visits, so I waited. 3 months passed. Then one evening, my phone rang. It was my son, panicked. My daughter-in-law's parents had been evicted. Debts had piled up. They needed a place to stay. Urgently. "Dad," he said softly, "we were hoping just for a while, until things settle." I let the silence stretch long enough for them to feel it. "I've already sold the house," I said calmly. The gasp on the other end was almost theatrical. My daughter-in-law grabbed the phone, her voice suddenly sweet. "Sold it? But where will you live?" "I moved," I replied. "Somewhere smaller. Somewhere peaceful." There was begging after that. Apologies, tears, promises that families should stick together. They asked to visit, to talk, to fix things. I agreed. They arrived a week later expecting boxes, maybe a cramped apartment. Instead, I met them at the gate of my home, the same house, now freshly renovated, brighter than ever. Their confusion was delicious. "I didn't sell," I said, opening the door. "I secured it. Permanently." I handed them a copy of the trust documents. Their names weren't there. Neither were their parents. The house would eventually go to charity, with one small condition: I would live here until my last breath, undisturbed. My daughter-in-law's face drained of color. My son couldn't meet my eyes. "You planned to move in while I was still alive," I said quietly. "You laughed about it over Christmas dinner. You thought I didn't hear?" They tried to deny it. I didn't let them. "I raised you to value people, not property." I told my son, "You chose comfort over conscience." They left without dinner that night. Now the house is quiet again. Peaceful. Mine. And every Christmas, I set one extra place at the table, not for them, but for my self-respect, finally reclaimed. The Christmas dinner felt like one of those rare moments when life pretends to be perfect. The table was full, the food was warm, and the house glowed with soft lights that reflected off the walls I had painted with my own hands years ago. That house, my 380,000 home, wasn't just property to me. It was proof of decades of early mornings, missed vacations, and silent sacrifices no one ever applauds. Every room held a memory, my wife humming while cooking, my son running down the hallway in socks, the quiet evenings when I sat alone and told myself it was all worth it. That night, I believed it still was. My son sat across from me, relaxed, laughing easily. My daughter-in-law smiled politely, passing dishes, playing the role perfectly. If someone had told me that betrayal was already unfolding under my own roof, I would have laughed it off. Family doesn't do that. Not at Christmas. Not to someone who gave them everything. Halfway through dinner, I stood up to grab dessert from the kitchen. The pie had cooled on the counter, the smell of cinnamon still thick in the air. As I reached for a plate, I heard voices from the living room, low, casual, unguarded. They didn't know I was there. That's what made it honest. My daughter-in-law spoke first, her tone light, almost amused. She talked about space, about how big the house was, how it was too much for one person. She laughed and said once my health declined a bit more, it would only make sense for them to move in. Her parents, too. She spoke as if it were already decided, like rearranging furniture that didn't belong to her. Then my son laughed. That sound hurt more than her words. He didn't hesitate. He didn't object. He agreed. He said they'd frame it as temporary, that I'd feel pressured but wouldn't resist. He won't say no, he said. He never does. In that moment, something inside me went completely still. I stood there, holding a plate, listening as my life was reduced to an inconvenience, and my home to a solution for their future. They weren't angry with me. They didn't hate me. And somehow, that made it worse. I wasn't a father to them anymore. I was an obstacle with an expiration date. They talked about bedrooms, about who would get what, about how I could take the smaller room, or maybe eventually move out altogether for my own comfort. They sounded practical, efficient, as if empathy were a luxury they couldn't afford. I realized then that betrayal doesn't always come with shouting or cruelty. Sometimes it comes wrapped in smiles, sitting at your table, calling you family. My hands were shaking, but my mind was sharp. I could have stormed in. I could have confronted them, demanded explanations, watched them scramble for excuses. But I didn't. I understood something very clearly in that moment. If I reacted with emotion, they'd see weakness. And they had already counted on that. So I took a breath. I picked up the dessert. I walked back into the dining room. I smiled. I served the pie like nothing had happened. I listened to their small talk. I watched my daughter-in-law avoid my eyes, not out of guilt, but out of carelessness. She assumed she was safe. My son joked about work, completely unaware that the version of me he knew had just disappeared. When they left that night, they hugged me, wished me Merry Christmas, told me to rest. I locked the door behind them and leaned against it in the dark. There was no anger then, no tears, just a heavy, unmistakable clarity, the kind that comes when illusions finally collapse. I understood that night that love based on what you can give is not love at all. And I promised myself something quietly, without drama or threats. No one would ever corner me in my own life again. That Christmas dinner didn't end my family. It revealed them. And once something is revealed, it can never be unheard. That night, after the door closed behind them and the house fell silent, I stood alone in the hallway for a long time. The clock ticked loudly, each second landing heavier than the last. I expected anger to rush in, expected my chest to tighten or my eyes to burn, but none of that happened. Instead, a strange calm settled over me. It wasn't peace, it was clarity. The kind that comes when something painful finally makes sense. I replayed their words over and over, not because I enjoyed the hurt, but because I needed to understand it fully. I realized how carefully they had spoken, how comfortable they were making plans about my life without me in the room. That comfort didn't come from cruelty. It came from certainty. They were certain I wouldn't fight back, certain I would stay quiet, certain I would sacrifice again, like I always had. That's when I made a decision that surprised even me. I would not confront them. Confrontation would have given them the advantage. They would cry, deny, twist the story, accuse me of misunderstanding. They would turn it into drama, and drama would blur the truth. I didn't want blurred truth. I wanted clean lines, clear proof, and control over my own ending. So I cleaned the table. I washed the dishes slowly, methodically, letting the warm water steady my hands. I folded the tablecloth. I turned off the lights one by one. Every small action felt deliberate, like I was putting away not just dinner, but an old version of myself, the man who believed honesty alone protected him. That night, I didn't sleep much, but not because I was restless. My mind was working quietly, assembling pieces. I thought about every time I had stepped back so others could step forward, every time I had said yes when I wanted to say no, every time I told myself that family meant enduring discomfort in silence. I saw now how that pattern had trained them, not to love me but to expect me. By morning, the decision was firm. I would respond with patience. Over the next few days, I acted exactly the same. I answered calls. I replied to messages. I laughed at jokes. I played my role so well that even I almost believed nothing had changed. But underneath that calm surface, something new was growing. Resolve. I was no longer reacting. I was observing. I paid attention to how often they checked in and what they asked about. Not how I was feeling, but how the house was doing. Repairs, bills, space. I noticed how conversations subtly circled back to convenience. How quickly concern disappeared once it didn't serve a purpose. That confirmed everything. Still, I said nothing. Silence, I learned, can be more powerful than accusation. It gives people space to reveal themselves fully, and they did, without pressure, without resistance. They continued as they were, unaware that every word, every pause, every lack of effort was strengthening my resolve. Inside, though, I was changing. I stopped feeling guilty for thinking about myself. That was new. For years, guilt had guided every choice. Guilt for having more, guilt for needing less, guilt for aging, guilt for existing as a burden in someone else's future. That guilt faded quietly, replaced by something steadier: self-respect. I reminded myself of facts, not feelings. I paid for this house. I maintained it. I built my life brick by brick. Wanting to keep it was not selfish. Wanting peace was not cruelty. Protecting myself was not betrayal. One afternoon, as sunlight poured through the living room windows, I sat alone on the couch and looked around. I didn't see a house anymore. I saw a boundary, and I understood that boundaries don't require announcements. They require consistency. From that moment on, every step I took was intentional. I spoke less. I listened more. I let them assume I was still predictable, still soft, still available. Not because I was afraid, but because patience was my strength now. People often mistake silence for weakness. They think the quiet ones have nothing planned. But silence, when chosen, is preparation. It's restraint. It's power held back until the timing is right. And as days turned into weeks, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Control. Not over them, but over myself. I wasn't angry. I wasn't plotting revenge fueled by rage. I was simply refusing to be cornered again. Refusing to let my life be rearranged by people who spoke about me as if I were already gone. That Christmas night had taken something from me: illusion, innocence, blind trust. But in return, it gave me something far more valuable: the clarity to act without emotion, and the patience to wait until the truth spoke for itself. Once the decision settled inside me, everything I did next felt strangely calm, almost ordinary. There were no dramatic gestures, no midnight breakdowns, no impulsive phone calls. I moved through my days the same way I always had, but now every step had direction. I wasn't acting out of fear or hurt anymore. I was acting out of self-preservation. A week after Christmas, I scheduled an appointment with a lawyer. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't hint at it. I walked into that office carrying years of quiet endurance, and one clear objective: my life would no longer be decided by people who saw me as temporary. I listened carefully as options were explained, asked questions I had never thought to ask before, and made choices that felt both heavy and relieving. When the paperwork was done, my home was no longer just a house. It was protected, locked behind legal walls stronger than guilt, or pressure, or false affection. Signing those documents felt like reclaiming something that had slowly slipped away from me over the years. Not just property, but authority over my own future. I walked out of that office lighter, even though nothing on the outside had changed yet. Then came the second part of the plan, one that required more discipline than paperwork ever could. I let them believe I was failing. In casual conversations, I mentioned a bad investment. I sighed a little longer when bills came up. I spoke about downsizing, about how maintaining a large place alone was becoming too much. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't complain. I simply planted the idea and let it grow on its own. What followed was revealing in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. Concern showed up briefly, surface level, polite. "That's tough," my daughter-in-law said once, her tone already drifting elsewhere. My son nodded sympathetically, but didn't ask questions. No one offered solutions. No one asked how I was coping emotionally. Their interest faded quickly, like a passing news headline replaced by something more relevant. And I watched. I watched how phone calls became shorter, how visits stopped entirely, how plans were always postponed. I noticed how help was never offered unless I asked directly, and even then it came with hesitation. The illusion of family loyalty dissolved without resistance. They didn't even realize they were proving my point. There was a quiet sadness in that realization, but also relief. Because doubt disappeared. I no longer wondered if I had misunderstood that Christmas night. Their behavior confirmed everything. During this time, I focused inward. I reorganized the house, not to prepare for leaving, but to reconnect with it. I sorted old photos, repaired things I had ignored, sat in rooms I rarely used. I wasn't mourning. I was grounding myself, reminding myself of what I had built and why it mattered. Each day strengthened my resolve. I didn't rush the next step. I let 3 full months pass. 3 months of silence from them unless something was needed. 3 months of learning what peace felt like when expectations were gone. I realized how much emotional energy I had spent anticipating other people's needs, managing their comfort, shrinking myself to avoid inconvenience. That energy returned to me slowly, like breath after holding it too long. Then, as if on cue, the phone rang. This time, their voices carried urgency. Their situation had changed. Things were difficult. Suddenly, family mattered again. Suddenly, my home wasn't too big anymore. It was necessary. Their words were careful, rehearsed, wrapped in apology without ownership. They spoke about togetherness, about temporary arrangements, about how much they missed me. I listened without interrupting. What struck me wasn't the request, it was the timing. Only when they needed something did I exist fully again. And instead of anger, I felt a deep sense of confirmation. This was exactly why I had stayed quiet, why I had waited, why I had prepared. When I finally responded, my voice was steady, calm, almost gentle. I told them I had made arrangements, that I had taken steps for my future, that things were no longer as they assumed. There was confusion, then panic. Questions piled up. Their certainty cracked. And for the first time, the power dynamic shifted completely. Not because I raised my voice, not because I demanded respect, but because I no longer depended on their approval or support. Ending that call, I sat alone in my living room and felt something unexpected. Pride. Not the loud kind, the quiet kind that comes from choosing yourself after years of being the afterthought. I had protected my home, yes, but more importantly, I had protected my dignity. That phase of my life taught me something no one ever says out loud. Sometimes the strongest revenge isn't punishment. It's preparation. It's patience. It's quietly stepping out of the role others assigned you and writing your own ending instead. The change didn't happen all at once. It crept in quietly, almost politely, the way fog rolls over a familiar road until you suddenly realize you can't see where you're going anymore. At first, it was small things. A missed call that wasn't returned until the next day. A conversation that felt rushed, distracted. I told myself not to read into it. People get busy. Life moves fast. That's what I'd always said to excuse the distance. But this time, I paid attention. When I mentioned that money was tight, that the idea of downsizing was becoming real, their reactions were carefully neutral, not worried, not curious, just detached. My daughter-in-law nodded sympathetically, but her eyes didn't linger. My son said, "That's rough," in the same tone people use when commenting on bad weather. No follow-up. No questions about what I planned to do next. Days turned into weeks, and the pattern became undeniable. They stopped dropping by. Invitations to dinner vanished. Holidays were suddenly complicated. When I called, conversation stayed shallow, ending quickly with promises to talk soon. I noticed how often soon never arrived. When I hinted that I might need help with something around the house, there was always a reason they couldn't make it. Work was hectic, traffic was bad. Maybe next weekend. Next weekend never came. What struck me most wasn't the absence, it was how easy it seemed for them. Letting go of me required no struggle, no guilt, no visible conflict. I had expected some hesitation, some internal debate. Instead, they adjusted effortlessly, as if I had simply faded into the background of their lives, like old furniture pushed into storage. And in that realization, something painful but important clicked. Their affection had conditions. As long as I was stable, useful, and quietly accommodating, I had a place. The moment I became uncertain, financially, physically, emotionally, I was inconvenient. Not enough to be openly rejected, but not worth investing in either. I existed in a gray area where neglect could be justified as business. That hurt more than any argument could have. Yet strangely, it also freed me. I stopped reaching out first, not out of spite, but out of curiosity. I wanted to see what would happen if I didn't bridge the gap. Days passed, then weeks. Silence stretched thin and then thinner. No check-ins. No concern. No, just seeing how you're doing. The message was clear without being spoken. I was alone. But I wasn't abandoned. There's a difference. Abandonment implies loss. What I felt instead was exposure, like a bandage had been pulled away, revealing a wound I didn't know was there. And once exposed, it could finally heal. I spent more time with myself during those months than I had in years. I ate meals alone without rushing. I took long walks. I sat in quiet rooms and let memories surface without pushing them away. I noticed how peaceful the house felt without tension, without unspoken expectations. I realized how often I had shaped my schedule around their availability, how many times I had postponed my own needs to remain convenient. That version of me felt distant now. Occasionally, guilt tried to creep in. A voice whispered that maybe I was being too harsh, too sensitive, that maybe this was just how families evolved. But each time doubt surfaced, reality answered it. Silence doesn't lie. Absence doesn't pretend. The truth was simple: when they believed I had nothing left to offer, they stopped showing up. And that truth, once accepted, no longer hurt the same way. It made me stronger. I stopped waiting for validation. I stopped hoping for gestures that would never come. I stopped explaining myself in my own head. Instead, I focused on stability, emotional and internal. I reminded myself daily that my worth wasn't measured by usefulness, and love that disappears under pressure was never secure to begin with. By the time they eventually reached out again, months later, voices suddenly warmer, concerns suddenly revived, I was no longer the same person they had quietly dismissed. The man who answered the phone wasn't desperate for connection. He was complete without it. And that was the moment I understood the real shift had already happened long before any confrontation or revelation. The distance they created, the coldness they thought would go unnoticed, had done something they never intended. It had taught me how to stand alone without feeling lonely. It had stripped away illusion and replaced it with self-respect. They thought withdrawing would weaken me. Instead, it prepared me. By the time the call finally came, I almost didn't recognize the number. It had been so long since they reached out with anything other than polite distance that my first instinct was to let it ring. Something told me not to. Not curiosity, certainty. I already knew why they were calling. The voice on the other end was my son's, but it sounded different. Tate, careful. The confidence I had heard for years was gone, replaced by hesitation that felt rehearsed and fragile at the same time. He asked how I was doing, the question landing awkwardly, like a formality he wasn't sure how to perform anymore. I answered simply. Calmly, I didn't ask how he was. I waited. There was a pause. Then he explained. Things had changed, he said. Unexpected expenses, problems he hadn't seen coming. His wife's parents were in trouble, serious trouble. They had lost their place, and nowhere else was available. He spoke quickly, words tumbling over each other, as if speed might soften what was coming next. They needed help. Then my daughter-in-law's voice joined the call. Softer now, warmer. The sharp edge I once overheard was gone, replaced by something almost sweet. She talked about family, about sticking together, about how difficult the past few months had been. She said she wished they had visited more. Said she felt terrible about the distance. I listened. What struck me wasn't what she said. It was what she didn't. There was no acknowledgement of absence when I needed them. No recognition of how easily they had stepped away when they thought I was struggling. Their concern wasn't about me. It was about space, shelter, convenience. Finally, it came. They asked if they could stay with me, just for a while. Until things stabilized, they promised it wouldn't be long. Promised respect. Promised gratitude. Promised everything people promise when they want something badly enough. For a moment, I said nothing. That silence did something to them. I could hear it, the shift in their breathing, the uncertainty creeping in. They were used to me responding quickly, reassuringly. Used to me filling gaps with comfort. This time, I let the gap remain. I told them I had already made arrangements. That my situation wasn't what they assumed. That my home, my life, my future were no longer open for negotiation. Confusion followed. Then urgency. Questions layered over each other. They asked what I meant. Asked where I was living. Asked why I hadn't told them. That was when I understood something important. They weren't upset about missing my life. They were upset about losing access to it. When I explained calmly, without accusation, that my home was no longer available, their tone changed. The warmth drained away. Frustration surfaced, barely disguised. My daughter-in-law said she didn't understand how I could turn my back on family. My son said he thought I'd be more supportive, especially given everything they were facing. Supportive. The word hung in the air like a challenge. I reminded him gently that support goes both ways. That family isn't something you remember only when you're cornered. I told him I had needed them too, once. That I had waited. That I had noticed who stayed and who didn't. There was no answer to that, just silence. Then came the begging. Not dramatic, not desperate, controlled, careful, but unmistakable. They promised change, promised to visit more, promised appreciation, promised to be better. Each promise sounded less convincing than the last, because none of them came with understanding. They wanted the door opened, not the lesson learned. I declined. Not angrily, not coldly, simply firmly. Ending that call felt final in a way I hadn't anticipated. My hands didn't shake. My heart didn't race. I felt steady, grounded. The weight I had carried for months lifted quietly, without ceremony. Later that evening, I sat alone in the house they once believed they could claim. The rooms were still, peaceful. I realized then that this moment, the begging, the reversal, the sudden need, was the truest confirmation of everything I had learned. They hadn't changed. Their circumstances had. And that was enough. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel cruel. I felt resolved. Because saying no wasn't about punishment. It was about refusing to repeat a pattern where my kindness became someone else's entitlement. They had come back when they needed something. I had stayed when I needed myself, and that made all the difference. When the door finally closed behind them for the last time, there was no dramatic slam, no shouting, no final words thrown like knives across the room. Just quiet, the kind of quiet that settles in after a storm has already passed. I stood there for a long moment, listening to my own breathing, noticing how steady it was. That's when I understood something clearly. The hardest part was already over, and it hadn't been saying no. It had been learning that I was allowed to. In the days that followed, I didn't feel lonely the way I once feared I would. Instead, I felt settled, grounded, as if I had finally placed my feet firmly on my own life rather than hovering on the edge of someone else's expectations. The house felt different, not emptier, but lighter. The air moved more freely. The silence wasn't sharp anymore, it was gentle. I spent time doing things I had postponed for years. I rearranged rooms not for practicality, but for comfort. I brought plants into spaces that had once felt like storage for memories rather than places to live. I cooked meals slowly, just for myself, without worrying whether anyone else would approve or complain. Each small act felt like reclaiming territory, not from them, but from the version of myself that had believed love meant constant accommodation. There were moments when memories surfaced unexpectedly. A laugh my son used to have when he was younger. A holiday from years ago when we all fit around the table without tension. Those memories didn't hurt the way I thought they would. They didn't pull me backward. They reminded me that love had existed once, and that I was capable of it. That mattered, because it meant my heart hadn't hardened. It had simply learned boundaries. Occasionally, messages came through. Short, polite, distant. I replied when I felt like it, not out of obligation. The urgency was gone on both sides now. They no longer tried to negotiate or persuade. The reality had settled in. I wasn't their safety net anymore, and I didn't need them to be my validation. One afternoon, while sitting by the window with sunlight warming the floor, it hit me how different my definition of family had become. It wasn't about shared blood or history anymore. It was about respect, about presence without agenda, about showing up even when there's nothing to gain. I realized that I didn't feel angry toward them. Anger requires attachment to an expectation. I had released mine. That release brought peace I didn't know I'd been missing. People talk about revenge as something loud, exposure, confrontation, humiliation. But what I experienced was quieter and far more powerful. My revenge was choosing myself without apology. It was denying access to those who only valued me when I was useful. It was building a life that didn't revolve around proving my worth to anyone else. I stopped explaining my choices to people who weren't living my life. I stopped justifying my need for peace. I stopped shrinking my happiness to avoid discomfort in others. In doing so, I discovered how much strength had always been there, buried under years of self-doubt disguised as kindness. As months passed, I noticed something else change. I smiled more easily. I slept better. I laughed without that familiar undercurrent of worry. I wasn't waiting for the next demand, the next subtle expectation, the next moment I'd have to give something up to keep the peace. Peace had become internal now, unconditional. Sometimes I thought back to that Christmas dinner, to the moment I stood in the kitchen, holding a plate, overhearing plans made as if I were already fading out of my own life. That moment could have broken me. It almost did, but instead it became a turning point. Not because of what they said, but because of what I finally heard. I heard the truth, and I chose to act on it. I didn't win by taking anything from them. I won by refusing to give away what mattered most: my dignity, my autonomy, my home, my sense of self. They left believing I was stubborn, maybe even cold. I stayed knowing I was finally whole. Now, when I sit at my table during the holidays, I still set fewer plates, but the emptiness no longer echoes. It feels intentional, honored. I raise a quiet toast to lessons learned late, but learned fully, to strength that grows in silence, to the kind of self-respect that doesn't need witnesses. They once believed I was predictable. They were wrong. I didn't just protect my house. I protected my life.